what it does show is the level of effort. But what it does show is the level of effort. Fuck's sake.
Effort. Can we please put that in the opening?
Can we
the
not? The effort and resources. Welcome to In Bits, the podcast that deconstructs our digital lives. I'm Nicola.
And I'm Liam, and we're both lecturers in IEDT in psychology and cyber psychology.
We are. We would also love to hear from you and get some feedback to find out how this is going. So please do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or a comment on Spotify now that you can do that, or send us a message on our socials because we really love to hear from you.
Yeah. So, Nicola, what are you in bits about for today?
Today, I am in bits about how the internet is radicalising everybody. Okay. Well, maybe not quite.
Sweeping statement.
Sweeping statement. Well, I didn't have a tabloid headline for this one, but I thought I would channel one as though it was a tabloid headline.
Okay.
But yeah, it's not quite true, obviously. But let's get into it. So what I want to look at today is the big picture of how technology is being used to radicalise, or at least how some of radicalisation might be exacerbated by technology and how some technology is being used to radicalise. It's not that all technology is being used and all people who are radicalised by technology.
Okay.
So who is most at risk of being radicalised by content online and by extremist influencers? Because there's been a lot of discussions in the news, and we're going to fully do a whole episode on the manosphere and incels. But after that TV program Adolescent came out, there was a lot of discussion about young men and radicalisation. But it really is a very big topic. But what we're going to look at today is who's most vulnerable to radicalisation kind of in general, why that is, and what is the pathway that people tend to follow, the different stages to believing in extreme ideologies and taking those kind of extreme actions. And also what, if anything, we can do to prevent this and to move people off the path once they've started down it.
Okay, so before we start, do we need any content warnings?
We do, but it's actually surprisingly not too bad today.
Okay.
So we will be talking quite a bit about the far right, but we won't be repeating their messaging. And we'll be talking about vulnerabilities to radicalisation. So we might mention things like mental health, discrimination, prejudice, but not in real detail. And we will mention violence, but again, we're not going to go into explicit detail about anything like that. So it's not too bad.
Okay.
I know, yeah. For us.
You say it's not going to be too bad, and then I'm just like, yeah, okay. I'll wait and see.
How it goes. Yeah. A little bit about kind of the context of this, the spread of extremist content online. I think that obviously there's a growing awareness that there is a rise in far-right ideology and extremism in Ireland, across Europe, worldwide, everywhere. And in Ireland, in our last general election, which wasn't all that long ago, these groups made very little ground, thankfully. They got a tiny percentage of the votes in the election, unlike in other European countries where they've been getting much more substantial majorities.
Well, Italy's government changed and became far right. Hungary's did. Poland as
literally
well.
Just did, yeah.
And it kind of trickled through Germany as well.
Not looking great, yeah.
Yeah.
It's not good. But their talking points are being spread online and oftentimes in the media as well. So off the top of your head, can you think of different types of extremist ideologies? Can you think of any examples of people in the public eye who might have spread this without even realising, or fallen for the messaging without even realising? These talking points, often people think they're real and they start talking about it.
I know there's a lot of, I think about immigration is probably one of the major ones we talk about, and particularly kind of unvetted immigrants that come into the country, and the use of some of the language around that.
Unvetted military age males.
Yeah. There's a lot of political ideologies around kind of marginalised groups generally. There was, in terms of some of the far right governments in Europe, around homophobia, Italy's government preventing gay couples from adopting kids, and some of that rhetoric in their election. In terms of ideologies being promoted here, I try to avoid some of it if I can.
Yeah.
A lot of people talk about it, particularly in terms of, I think, immigration in the last election was the large one.
Yeah.
I don't think I've seen many other kind of extreme ideologies outside that.
There's a little bit of the boycott libraries because drag queens reading books to children. There's a tiny fringe minority who are all head up about that. But yeah, we tend to have more of the far right stuff here.
Yeah.
So what I'm calling the far right includes kind of a wide array. Sorry, I'm going to say that again because that is not a word. A wide array of viewpoints, from like outright fascism to Christian nationalism to white supremacy and pronatalism. Have you ever come across that one?
No.
That's a bunch of Silicon Valley types and trad wife style people who believe in having lots of children.
Oh, I know the trad wife concept, but
yes, and the idea is, you've heard the Great Replacement Theory, where the immigrants are going to replace the white people. Oh no! And so pronatalism is like making white people have more babies so that you won't get outnumbered, essentially. So it is white supremacist and far right.
Yeah, but I think with all of these tones, like it's very different when you're talking about like far right. You're not saying that like right-wing politics is wrong. Because
like there's conservative politics, which is like within the mainstream, but this is outside the mainstream.
That's the point I'm trying to differentiate between conservative politics and like far-right extremism.
Yes. But unfortunately, a lot of conservative politics is looking like far-right. Like if you look at the US, their conservative politicians supposedly now are quite extreme.
This unusual middle right now, which is actually their traditional conservative politics, and like even in the UK, like
their Labour Party has gone full right. I mean, I don't know what you do with that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So everything like that. Also, of course, things like anti-Semitism, homophobia, the so-called gender-critical feminists or TERFs, which are trans-exclusionary radical feminists. They are not feminist at all. So they have huge overlap with other conservative and right-wing ideologies. Like they are inherently quite misogynistic and quite right-wing as well.
Did you see at Mighty Hoopla a series of different artists, like Kate Nash particularly? She had a go at TERFs, and she was like talking about how if you were a feminist, you couldn't be a TERF at the same time. And I think that we're starting to see a lot more kind of public, kind of not backlash, but actually opposition.
Yeah. Yes.
And even she has experienced a huge amount of hate since Hoopla from TERFs. Yeah. So even that is quite interesting.
Very active in hating people online. We might need a whole episode about that.
Okay, we're planning episodes here.
We're not. Yeah, we're kind of not focusing on specific groups today, although more the right wing extremist. But the kind of the way this all works is similar across all these different groups. So you've got all those. Of course, you've got like the kind of extremist religious groups, whatever kinds they are. So from Islamic extremist groups to Christian extremist groups, etc. So there's all that. They're all far right conservative, just with a different religious bent. They've got a lot in common with each other. And then you've got left wing extremists like anarchists and so on, as well as the manosphere and incels, like we mentioned. So I think that's kind of the main ones. There's lots of subgroups within those. But I think
we've covered quite a few.
There's quite a few there. It's probably more. Like there's quite a lot of extremism. We tend to hear a lot about how social media is spreading these ideologies. And I am going to talk about that. But the traditional media also really plays a role here. So a really good example of mainstream media spreading this information, and a really incredibly naive example of this at best, and really terrible idea for what article should be at worst, was in the Irish Times in 2017. It was an editorial piece that they published by someone who is known to identify with the alt-right and support the kind of right-wing extremist sentiments that they have. And this piece was called "The Alt-Right Movement, Everything You Need to Know." Snappy little article, which included lots of definitions straight from the mouths of extremist commentary into the pages of the Irish Times, which is one of the main Irish newspapers. So it was taking expressions that they use and then giving you a definition of them. So things like a blue hair is an aggressive, unpleasant feminist with brightly coloured hair, usually depicted as being overweight. Fasci is possessing a fascist aesthetic. These are just presented without any commentary, and they included other extremely racist and hateful terms, which I am absolutely not going to repeat here, but they were just presented as like, oh, this is just interesting information to know, which is
it's just hate speech.
Really, yeah, platforming hate speech. And it normalizes it, and it gives it an appearance of, well, first of all, being normal, and that there's greater consensus on it than there actually is in reality.
Right.
So if you think about then things like Fox News, GB News in the UK, other very hyper-partisan news sources like Breitbart and so on, they're also very responsible for spreading and normalising this kind of information. And when we get into talking about misinformation, I'm sure we're going to cover this as well.
Yeah, we do.
So what the research suggests is that media and political figures actually have a lot more sway than social media in terms of convincing people to believe particular ideals, ideologies, etc. But that doesn't mean that social media doesn't contribute to it. So it really does in a number of different ways. What is interesting, though, is that we know in Ireland, right, there's a small core group of agitators, particularly the right wing, but they are bolstered by a large number of bot accounts that amplify their message, which gives, of course, the appearance that it is much more popular than it actually is.
You're going to get algorithmic bias in that as well.
You absolutely are.
Too, that make it seem like it's much more prevalent.
Yes.
And that your views are aligning and the popularity of these. Like, it's not just a series of bots. There is going to be the
of course
general social media algorithm in
Yeah.
that.
And actually, there's a campaign group called Global Witness that investigate bot accounts, but also algorithmic bias in political campaigns around the world. So they investigated it in Ireland on X, and they found loads of bot accounts that took part in loads of online discussions about anti-migrant protests. Particularly, there was one in Coolock in Dublin, which was quite a big one. And they included loads of hashtags like Ireland belongs to the Irish, and lots of conspiracy theories like that Great Replacement theory, and that the Irish government was plotting to import thousands of criminals to create chaos and justify social repression. They were encouraging people to join the protests, and they were very racist, very xenophobic. And of course, when you get anything like this, also misogynistic, because that's the like sprinkle of flavoring on top of everything else.
But like when those protests happened, they were very visible on X at the time. Mm-hmm. And like even being reported in the news not too long ago, in terms of like an inquest, it was like, we've won and we can now show you a model of how this is going to work. And it was like this very like indoctrinating kind of style of, here's a handbook for chaos.
Yes.
And here's how you can disrupt to the point where it won't happen, rather than all of the issues that were actually in the background of that event, of like a lack of consultation, which I absolutely get, making sure that these centres for immigrants that are coming in are actually fit for purpose and meet basic kind of human rights as well. Yeah,
and that the environment they're going into has the resources to support all the new people coming in, as well as the people who actually live there, because they often are in areas that are already under-resourced.
But a lot of the arguments and why they're probably so effective is they're not always extreme in their discussions. So like things like education, like healthcare service providers, mental health provision, like something as basic as like shops and resources, and things like parking, which are some of the areas that are actually mentioned by people in that consultation process.
Yes.
I get those.
Yeah.
Not when it gets to the like xenophobia or general.
Yeah. Not when you're standing outside a centre screaming at children to go back to their country that they came from.
No.
Then you've lost me a little before you get there. What was interesting, though, is that like the bot accounts weren't located in Ireland. So they looked at 45 in particular, and they were really active ahead of the UK general election. And then they pivoted to the anti-migrant protests in Coolock. They pivoted then to the assassination attempt against Donald Trump. So they were being used for just division in general. They also promoted climate change denial, other conspiracy theories. So they were just picking up on particular campaigns in a directed way. I know. It's clever. Really interesting. So they produced over 600,000 posts from the 22nd of May to the 22nd of July, 2024.
Wow.
Yeah. Like that is a huge amount of content to be pushing into these areas, and it makes it look like something has a huge amount more support than it actually does.
See the use of bots and some of these websites reminds me of the Trump-Clinton election and where misinformation first started to come in. And even though it wasn't found to be in terms of the misinformation posts, it wasn't found to be the deciding factor in terms of the frequency, the amount of them that started to be generated started to have an impact.
Yes.
So like 600,000 posts in the lifespan
in 2 months,
huge.
I know, particularly for Ireland. Like we're not that big. Yeah.
And how many were the bots singular account or multiple account?
Well, this was 45 of them that they had looked at, but there were loads more.
Okay.
Yeah. The same people, Global Witness, they've also investigated this kind of content and algorithmic recommendations in Poland, Romania, Germany, all of them ahead of their general elections. And they found the algorithms, particularly for TikTok and YouTube, were pushing hard right content at much higher levels than other political content. So it's not always organic content that we're seeing amplifying these messages, right? It's
But it's salacious content too.
It is. And it's specific campaigns. And it's often not even... So we know like Russia has bot farms and they just promote divisive messages to every side of every argument everywhere in the world pretty much because they want to cause disruption and social chaos. So they might be putting out Trump messages and anti-Trump messages. Unfortunately, the content that they spread that's more far-right content tends to spread further because people share it more, it gets more attention, it's more viral. But they are actually just promoting chaos generally. So this is not actually a terribly new phenomenon in terms of using technology to spread misinformation, extreme views, propaganda, and terrorist ideology, right? It's been amplified by the internet for sure, and by social media, but radicalization, the use of technology and media to spread it, goes back centuries. So can you think of any other technology that's been used to spread ideological information?
Well, when you talk about technology, the big one I think of is like propaganda generally. So like propaganda posters, the printing press is a piece of technology.
Huge one. Yeah,
So-
exactly. Yeah, no, I'm talking that and even further back.
Oh, even further back. Further back than the printing press for...
You want some examples?
Yeah, go.
Hangings, public hangings.
Right.
Right, so you do them on like market days or festival days so that everybody would come from the surrounding area and they'd spread the message back to all their villages. Murals, Northern Ireland,
Oh, yeah.
Nazi Germany, the KKK, they all used murals to claim territory and send like a terrorizing message to people to warn them that this is a particular area you need to be afraid in if you don't agree with them.
ISIS and beheadings.
Exactly. Radio, TV, film, all hugely used by all of these different organizations. Like the Nazis were kind of early adopters of technology for propaganda, shall we say.
Yeah.
But film and radio and print media for sure.
But there's a lot of... Well, it reminds me of that really famous poster. Was it of Reagan and Gorbachev kissing?
There's a big mural of it in
Berlin.
In Berlin, yeah.
And like that's like they propaganda became art as well, and that was how it kind of increased its viral ability as well.
It's really fascinating. In Nazi Germany, the KKK, ISIS, they've all used loads of technology. If you think about people like Alex Jones using radio, it's a new form of radio, but using radio to spread propaganda, extremist views, etc. So this sort of stuff, like with every new piece of technology that comes along, you find extremists using it, and they're sometimes very early adopters of it. So right-wing extremists were actually some of the earliest adopters of the internet. They started with bulletin boards to share information. Then they got websites. They were some of the first websites they claim that were up. Then social media, more recently into encrypted chat and encrypted groups. When they get into areas like that now with encrypted chat and groups, it means a smaller number of people accessing it. So when they were like big on Twitter, ISIS were huge on Twitter, right? There were hundreds of thousands of accounts. So anyone could come across it, but it meant the barrier to entry was very low. So there were lots of people who were just like, oh, this is kind of interesting, but they would never have done anything. But now that it's in encrypted chats, you have to be invited in. The barriers to entry are higher. So the numbers are lower, but the people who are in there are perhaps much more committed.
Much higher on the range. Okay. Yeah.
And it's a much stronger echo chamber when you get in there because there's no opposing views. So
Kind of like it's very incel culture.
yeah, very insulated.
Yeah.
Yeah. So lots of groups have taken advantage of technology. ISIS in particular use video at kind of unprecedented rates for inspirational speeches, instructions, memorials, and of course, videos of those beheadings and all those kind of things to spread violence and terror. It's still being used in lots of those kinds of ways, also for fundraising, knowledge sharing, and recruitment, of course, which is really what we're talking about today. But I think biased and manipulated algorithms and armies of bots are part of spreading that messaging for recruitment now.
But it reminds me, and like you've already used the Nazi Germany example, but it's like Hitler at the Nuremberg rallies or Hitler Youth, and like all of those kind of messages being spread on a continuous basis while the war
indoctrination.
was happening.
Yeah. So I want to talk about what terrorist ideology actually is, just really briefly, so that we kind of have an idea of what it is in our head. It has particular features, right? So there's kind of 4 features to it. It is really polarized. So these groups really operate on a very, very strong in-group, out-group bias, which we've talked about before a little bit. But basically, when you're in an in-group and you view other people as in an out-group, you are much more likely to do them harm. whether that's online, offline, anywhere at all. And that can be quite arbitrarily grouped. Like if you've ever heard of the experiment of the blue-eyed kids versus the brown-eyed kids.
Jane Elliott. Yeah.
Jane Elliott. Really arbitrarily grouping people can get them to behave worse towards the outgroup.
But it's the language the polarized groups use. It's very much us versus them language.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They can't understand us. Like there's a whole...
Exactly. And that bonds the in-group together. So you know that thing, united against a common enemy? That is what happens here. So it's really threat-oriented. So that's the second feature of it. So that external threat from the out-group increases group cohesion for the in-group. It brings them and ties them tighter together. The ideology is also absolutist, right? It's black and white, good versus evil. There's no grey area in it. There's no nuance in it. And of course, these ideologies are hateful. So they're aimed at energizing people to take violent action. And they do that by encouraging moral disengagement. So they use different techniques, things like dehumanization, right? You saw that in the Rwandan genocide, calling people cockroaches. You see it currently in Gaza, the way that some of the Israelis are talking about Palestinian people as worse than animals, non-human, and so on. And that erodes the barrier that you might have against committing violence to other people. So it allows you to justify that violence that you might commit. And most people in your in-group probably won't end up committing violence, but their support of it encourages and increases the risk of others committing it. So only a small number of people go on to commit violence, usually within a group, except in very extreme circumstances like, the Rwandan genocide, for example, where you've got a lot of people doing it. But the general kind of agreement that violence is necessary or okay allows that violence to be justified. So, Liam, who do you think is most at risk of radicalisation?
Generally?
Yeah.
People who might be more isolated. I'm going to be slightly biased and say there's a relationship with education level, whether that's right or wrong. Maybe people who are or have experienced or have had negative experiences with the particular group that they're opposed against. Yeah. They're generally.
In terms of education, do you think there'd be any particular kinds of education that people would have that would make them more likely to be radicalised?
In terms of people who are educated, let's have a pop off other academic disciplines. Theology, maybe.
Interesting.
Maybe.
Okay, you're so wrong on everything. Maybe not everything,
I'm
but
okay
like a
to
lot of
accept
things.
that. That's fine.
It's nice to actually have a subject that you don't know that much about, because we generally know so much about so many different things that it's hard to find one where you don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is, I think, what a lot of people would think of who is most at risk. It actually varies quite a lot.
Are they stereotyped it?
A little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. So there was a recent paper by Sherman and Carthy in 2025, right? So really recent. And what they did was look at radicalized individuals across Europe and North American countries. They looked at both jihadist and right-wing extremists and the general population to see how they differed from each other. So they also, within that, which is really unusual, most studies don't do this, they looked at those that used terrorist violence and those who don't. So extremists versus terrorists, right? Because you can be extreme without being violent. Your rhetoric might be violent, but you might not have committed violence. Where you commit violence, that is a different population group, right? So general population, those who are extremists and those who actually use violence in a terrorist way. What they found is that those who are radicalized are far more likely to be men, right? 5 times more likely to be men than women. And 25 times more likely to be men for terrorists. So that's the ones who actually commit violence.
That's interesting. I didn't even, when you were asking me those questions, I didn't necessarily even think about women. And I don't know whether it's more so a media portrayal or like a cinematic portrayal of terrorism and radicalization. But my head was just male.
If you think back to the people who left the UK and Ireland to go support the jihadis, it was often women going to like support the men in their journey. Like quite a lot of women went as well, but not as many as men, obviously. They are also quite likely to feel that they lack political representation, right? So it's not that they necessarily lack political representation, but they have a perception that they do. And they're more likely to be unemployed and to have suffered ACEs. So that's the adverse childhood experiences that we talked about in the social support episode. And for those who committed violence in particular, they have communicated a desire to hurt others and more than likely have a criminal history. They're no more likely than the general population to suffer with mental health difficulties, right? This comes up a lot. A lot of people think that people who are extremist have some sort of mental health difficulty. That is not the case. In some cases, they have lower rates of some conditions. The prevalence rates for lone actors, though, tends to be above population averages. So that's people who act out on their own. They have extremist views, but they're not acting with a group. But for group-based terrorism, the rates are lower. This is just a reminder that people who have mental health diagnoses are far more likely to have violence committed against them than to be perpetrators. People always forget that. They often think when someone's done something awful that it must be mental health related. That is absolutely not the case. We also tend to characterize people who commit terrible acts as psychopaths. But people who commit violence for terrorism purposes are typically doing it for a cause, right? They're willing to give up their life for a cause. They tend to have very strong connections to other people in the radical group. And that is not something that a psychopath has.
They're not psychopaths.
Psychopaths don't care about other people, and they certainly don't care about a cause. There is some evidence, so we talked about education, that engineering education makes it a little bit more likely for people to become extremists.
You're going to have to explain that.
I know. And it is because it is black and white education, right? There's no nuance. If you talk about studying the arts or psychology or social sciences, there's a ton of nuance in there. It's not black and white, right? You're trying to use your critical thinking to get to the core of arguments, to work out something that's going on, to present logical arguments and so on.
So something is either factual and correct in engineering, whereas particularly within psychology or humanities disciplines, it's all about academic discourse and argument. And
there's very rarely a yes/no answer.
No, but yeah. No,
Sorry. But yeah, see?
That's my instant response. Yeah, no, but it's the ability or the kind of growth of knowledge and what we look for in a student.
Yes.
Or anyone who's learning in a degree is that their critical thinking grows.
Yeah.
And their self-development, their ability to question themselves also grows.
Yeah.
And if there's literally only a correct way of doing something and a wrong way of doing something, you're not developing that ability to kind of retrospectively think or learn from mistakes either.
Yeah. And to sit with uncertainty.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting. Now, that does not, of course, mean that everyone studying engineering or like science subjects is going to be radicalized. It's just that there's slightly more people who come from this background that are ending up radicalized. As well as that, different radical groups have different profiles, particularly in relation to socioeconomic deprivation and educational attainment. So European jihadists are less likely to be employed, whereas US extremists are no more likely to have experienced socioeconomic deprivation or low education. So two very, very different groups. One of the reasons that European jihadists become extremists is because they are actually experiencing deprivation. There's discrimination. They're maybe living in projects, etc. Whereas right-wing extremists in the US, not necessarily. So in general, there's a lot of variation between extremists in terms of their characteristics. So it's not actually a very reliable way to predict who might commit violence or who is likely to become radicalized, right? So trying to find groups and say, well, those are the ones that are going to be radicalized really doesn't work. So rather than focusing on a particular type of person, more the idea that it's a dynamic process of radicalization is more accurate. And that allows us to focus on the vulnerabilities that might make someone more receptive or open to radicalization. Pretty much all models of radicalization start with vulnerabilities that are leveraged by the extremist groups as sources of motivation towards their radicalization. So let's get into how people become radicalized. So what gets them on that pathway and draws them further into it. And then at each stage, we're going to look at what are the best ways to try and derail that process. So if someone you know, someone close to you is starting to get radicalized, what can you do at each of the stages to try and get them out of it? And in the later stages, what can like the government or kind of like non-profit organizations maybe do to help? Because when somebody gets really deep into it, it's actually quite difficult to get them out. So Liam, what do you think it is that actually attracts people into radical groups?
So we've spoken about the different backgrounds of people, the different types of education. So some of my kind of stereotypes are kind of dispelled a little bit, not too much. Like, I think of people who I would describe as radicalized or far right. Yeah, I'm starting with a sigh. It's not good. They would think that they're the only person with the answer to the problem, and that everyone else is blind and can't see the answer to the problem. I'm kind of describing a personality type here as well.
That feels like someone who's already in it.
Yeah, they feel like they are creating the solution to the problem, and that this is a new thing, as opposed to they're already have potentially been radicalized or in that stages. I want to say a sense of community or shared sense of belonging.
Yes. That's
Am I
very
hitting
much
the nail
it.
on the head there?
Yes.
Like, why does anyone join any particular group, online or offline? It's a sense of self, sense of belonging, community, wanting to feel understood or heard.
Yes.
Self-esteem.
All of that. Okay. That is definitely it. So there's a number of stages in the process or this pathway. And there's loads of different models that look at this, right? And they have a lot of features and stages in common. But there's a really recent piece of research by Emily Booth and colleagues, which I'll link to in the show notes. And they looked at different data sets, including online communications of fringe groups, accounts of former believers in different extremist ideologies, and existing research. And they formulated a radicalization pathway that includes online information seeking and community as part of it, because it is so central to how people become radicalized online and offline, but particularly we can see how this happens online. So they've outlined 6 steps of radicalization, and they align really well with the other models that I mentioned. So I'm not going to go through all the models, you don't need to know them all, but just know that this one aligns very well with it. But the thing that all of these models have in common is the vulnerabilities that make someone being more open to radicalization. So stage 1, they call uncertainties and questions. And there's 3 influences in particular that make people vulnerable here, including a need for significance in the world, for a narrative or a worldview that gives you structure, meaning, and purpose to your existence, and a need for network and community, right? Okay, really foundational core needs that help you find your place in the world, know how it works, understand how to move through it, and feel like there's some meaning in it for you.
Belonging.
Absolutely. So the pre-radicalization stage is often marked by some sort of disillusionment with the world, right? So it can be perceived injustice or humiliation, or real injustice or humiliation, but it doesn't have to be real. You can just feel like you are being discriminated against, even if you're not. Okay. So you see this a lot with incels, for example. Yeah. They feel like the world is turning into a matriarchal society and everything's about women and men don't have a place anymore. And of course, that's not quite true. But they have this perception of being victimized. And that is as important as any sort of real injustice or humiliation. That's actually quite central to understanding violence in general. So it can come from actual discrimination, but it doesn't have to. It can also come from things like poverty, unemployment, or other kind of perceived adversity. So again, with incels, it might be not being able to get a girlfriend, and that's the perceived adversity there. We will talk about incels more, so I don't want to give too much away in this episode for it. I need to find some other ways, other examples to talk about. But extremist ideology gives people meaning and purpose because they're often trying to create a utopian vision of the world. So white supremacy, jihadist extremism, they're like trying to create a world where they run everything in their worldview the way that it should be done. And that's going to create the perfect place for everybody, well, for everybody who looks like them and thinks like them, and everyone else is just in the way. The need for identity and belonging. So this is where the very black and white nature of ideology is attractive to people, because the world is increasingly complex and uncertain. And, you know, there's been a lot of change in the last few decades. And for people who find that difficult to navigate, it allows people to define their identity through the membership of a particular group and identify with the messages of that group. The initial attraction, like you said, is often with the actual community itself and how welcoming they are. And that fulfills that need for belonging.
Which is kind of like confusing because you're associating this with generating violence or having an underpinning of kind of like general cruelty or evil or whatever language you want to use. Yeah. But it's this like happy community, come in and we're going to welcome you along and you're going to be a part of us and you're going to gain that sense of self. And they do. And it's this almost like false sense of security that is providing the connection.
Yes. There's a really good TED talk by Erin Saltman from a few years ago now, but she went undercover into a youth extremist group in Hungary. And she said when she went into it, she was really surprised because it was really fun to start with. Like, it was a lot of the typical activities you might have in a youth group as a teenager. It was only when you started mentioning people that they didn't like the Roma community or Jewish people, that the hate started to come out. So they do bring you in using typical ways of attracting people into a community around shared identity, belonging, fun, you know.
I'm just imagining Jojo Rabbit. That's all I'm thinking of. Have you seen that film?
No.
Oh my God. That's your homework.
Okay.
It's fantastic. Like I'll send you the link, but the director of it plays Hitler, this little boy's imaginary friend.
Okay.
And he's in Hitler Youth, and he's like, obviously the director of it is gay, so there's a gay Jewish director playing Hitler in this film, and he's an imaginary friend, and Hitler's like super camp, and Hitler Youth go around and they learn how to like be violent, so they stab like teddy bears. Oh, like, I'm going to make you watch this. That's all I was picturing.
Very surreal.
But it's hilarious. But that's all I was picturing as you were like, it's this happy youth group place, and they go to like summer camp for Hitler Youth. Mm-hmm. Okay, I'm going to send you a link for this.
Okay, cool. That's my weekend, next weekend. So what's interesting is the particular type of radicalization that someone experiences might give more insight into what their vulnerability was. For those who joined far-right communities, the circumstances that contributed to that were more likely to be a sense of loneliness, and they maybe felt inadequate due to lack of friends or negative experiences with girls when they were in school, right? So this is coming from the research on those particular groups. But if you look at another kind of group that believes in extremist conspiracy theories or ideas, like anti-vaxxers, their distrust might come from the country's healthcare system, exacerbated by maybe COVID-19 or the birth of a new child. Anxiety about their child experiencing pain could be a trigger. It could be women's own experience of childbirth, which often isn't all that great. And so they have mistrust in the medical system. So there's different triggers and there's different vulnerabilities that people can use to leverage people into extremist views. So these personal vulnerabilities might co-occur with some sort of exposure to extreme content or like small bits of extreme content. And that might trigger the start of the radicalization process. And that might be in political or religious settings or other settings like that. And for a lot of people who've been radicalized more recently, the uncertainty and fear that came about with COVID, you know, it was such a huge change in the world. People didn't know what was happening. They were looking for some certainty, some answers. And that was a trigger point for a lot of people to be radicalized.
But there was also points during COVID where people were getting information or healthcare information that wasn't necessarily correct either. And then that information would change, and then that would create uncertainty.
Absolutely. And like some of the sources they were getting that misinformation from should have been trustworthy, like the White House, for example, and was not always.
Corrects. Is the big one,
Yeah. At this early stage, this first step of pre-radicalization, people might exit the pathway through having access to reassuring advice from a trusted source. So that could be a news report from someone reputable, or a reputable website like a government fact sheet, or consultation with authoritative figures like doctors or community leaders, or even someone's parents, for example. So at this point, just having good quality evidence available can be really helpful. The second stage is curiosity and criticism. And this is the stage where people are seeking to clarify their thoughts on whatever it is that's worrying or concerning them. So, for example, if they are questioning the effectiveness of vaccines, they might talk to their doctor, they might tentatively disclose their views or their questions about it. Or for other kind of ideologies, they might disclose interest in fringe views to people that they know. So in situations like that, if you or if experts that they disclose to reacted with a stigmatizing reaction, so if you were like disbelieving that they could believe that, or you mocked them or you shamed them and you're like, oh my God, that's so stupid. Yeah.
That's going to shut them down, and they're going to throw the wall up, and they're going to completely disassociate from anything you have said, even though you're from an area of expertise.
Exactly. And it accelerates the radicalization process, because guess where they retreat to? Their safe online space where people understand them and reassure them. So any sort of negative reactions, judgment, disparagement, aggression, produces quite visceral shame and embarrassment. And it makes people regret placing their trust in the person that they disclose to, right? So you're shutting off a valuable exit from this radicalization pathway and actually shoving them further into that pathway. So going back into these online spaces further exposes them to content that like aligns with their views, or they might post about their experience of sharing and then they get loads of support and encouragement from other people. Those relationships, that existence of those relationships online, the strength of them is really key to recruitment to these groups, particularly at this point. So, when people talk about this happening, particularly people who were radicalized and they come out of it, they talk about this in a very emotional way, the stigmatizing reactions. And so empathetic and non-judgmental reactions from trusted people is so important at this point. So if there's one thing we can get across is if someone starts questioning, if you have a young person who's looking at the manosphere or any kind of extremist content, that you talk to them in a way that's non-judgmental and that is empathetic. So it might be useful to create resources for people on how to talk to someone who's expressing fringe views.
So there's a really good example of this.
Okay, cool.
So Donny O'Sullivan, who's an Irish journalist, he did
Donny.
he did a piece for CNN and he interviewed a QAnon conspiracy theorist. She was heavily involved. She didn't watch the news. She would talk to friends and family who had similar right-leaning politics, Republican traditional views, and she was a huge Trump supporter, and he told people not to watch the news and that it was all like fake news and misinformation. And she expected that there was going to be martial law declared when Joe Biden was elected. Mm-hmm. She assumed that everything was going to be shut down, that like Hollywood reporters and actors and actresses and like Lady Gaga performing at the inauguration were all going to be arrested and that Donald Trump would come back into power. But the way he did that interview was really, really good because he was openly discussing with her, where did your views come from? What kind of information did you have? And she would watch like a TikTok and her algorithm would be deep within QAnon. And he wasn't judgmental. He was very open with the interview and he was like, he was like very relaxed in the way he approached it with her. And she was talking about her relationship with her daughter and her family and how she retreated socially from anyone who didn't align with her beliefs and views. And I was just picturing that interview at that time. And I will still use that in my persuasion module, because I think it's a really good example of how you can see how someone experiences and believes misinformation. And I wasn't even approaching it from a radicalization angle, but the opposite to what you're talking about of the judgment or the criticism. She actually opens up so nicely with them. So we might stick a link to the show notes and for that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely. And it sounds like she's slightly further along in this pathway, which maybe we'll come back to, because I think it's a good example of, she talked about like removing herself from her family and stuff, which is definitely further along the pathway. So the next stage is that of connection. This is where the person starts to view themselves as part of the community centered around whatever the issue is or whatever the extremist beliefs are. And they start to internalize the beliefs of the community. And that changes their sense of identity, right? So their identity starts to really strongly become the in-group identity. And the deepening of the views is often enabled by spending a lot of time in the online fringe spaces, researching, doing their own research, reading a lot about a topic. And they start to get a thrill from seeing the patterns and connecting the dots between their own anxiety and what they see as plausible explanations for it online.
Okay.
So 2 it's giving them something.
12.
Yeah, but it's giving them something to help them feel better about their own situation, their own perceived situation. Okay. And this is where you see people withdrawing from their existing networks. And they start to see those people as outsiders now. So the people that were in their in-group are now the out-group. So they might actually stop talking about the topic with their peers and stop reading mainstream information sources and start to behave less kindly towards people they view as outsiders. So this is all part of like renegotiating their own identity as part of the in-group. So they're increasingly relying on the fringe community for their social needs, their informational needs, and they can actually start to feel quite happy and certain and hopeful and get reassurance from this group. And that validates their feelings as well. So they start to become just much more ingrained in the group at this point. Their early anxieties might be alleviated by being part of this community, because it's lovely joining a new community, right? It's a really nice feeling. You feel like you belong. There are fewer opportunities for getting somebody out of this pathway in terms of like fact checking doesn't really reach people at this point. Organic de-radicalization spaces actually become more useful at this point. This is where previously radicalized people speak to others about what they believed and try to provide them with more reliable information. They often exist online. Sometimes people just come across them accidentally. They may feel shame at having been involved in the fringe group and not want to discuss it with other people outside. But former believers are like a safe space for discussing that and a trusted source of information. So they can be really, really useful at this point.
It's quite traumatic. Like you've had a new social construction of your identity and who your connections are and where you find belonging and a sense of self. And then for other people to be critical or nasty and kind of pull that down. So I'm trying to provide a balanced view here. And then someone who was within that community has experienced exactly what you have experienced are able to then
reach them.
I was going to say to pull you out of that space, and it may not necessarily be pull you out of that space instantly, but for them to find someone else who's like-minded but isn't extremely within the rabbit hole.
Yeah, exactly. And who understands them and understands where they're at and understands their vulnerabilities and can reach them and see them for who they are without the judgment.
Without the judgment aspect, yeah.
The fourth stage is community investment. So this is really deep immersion in the community and its beliefs. This is where they're contributing their own ideas, their own interpretations. They have lifestyle change. Their peer group really changes a lot. They distance themselves from their former close peers, family, etc. And the whole lens through which they view the world shifts, right? So they start to see everything in the world in a different way. If you've ever talked to anybody who's deep in conspiracy theories or radicalization, they interpret everything differently. Like we just can't agree on a common ground of facts. You've heard the expression alternative facts. That's essentially what this is. So again, you've got increasing hostility towards the outgroup, a more derogatory view of members of the outgroup, increasing acceptance of violence at this stage. And the group identity is a shield against de-radicalization efforts because the individual values the community itself, right? They're relying on it for so much, their social needs, their sense of self, belonging, identity, everything like that. And that keeps them radicalized. It keeps them in an echo chamber where they're just not getting any conflicting information at all. All of this new sense of identity and belonging can lead to feelings of elation and feeling like you're one of the chosen people, the special people who've been called to a particular cause as well. So all of this can feel quite positive at this point. This might be the point in kind of people's day-to-day networks where their amnosty actually comes out, and you might start to see signs of radicalization. It might become more obvious, and that might result in, of course, in further stigma from their peer group and from family and so on, and a loss of support from other people. So again, they're driven further into the fringe group. Some of the previous exit pathways may still work, so a trusted and empathetic friend or those organic de-radicalization spaces with former members of the radical group. But here you might also see some new pathways. Sometimes what happens here is that someone has something really significant happen in their life, like a big personal shock. So maybe a death of someone close to them or something personal to them that's a really significant realization, like their sexual orientation, or something significant like an election outcome. And all of that can be so shocking that it forces them to reconsider their views. So these are really deeply personal experiences that kind of make people confront their own views and think about their life and their circumstances. So it kind of gives the idea that, like, you know, obviously something like this isn't going to happen to everybody that's been radicalized, but the intervention methods need to be deeply personal at this stage rather than any sort of factual or logical arguments against the ideology itself. The fifth stage is around erratic behavior. So people here are wanting to feel a need to give back to the group that they're part of or take action on behalf of the group's goals. So they're feeling heightened motivation and preparation. In something like religious radicalization, this might be where they do something like undergo training with others, learn how to carry out attacks. And this is the stage where people are making their views more public. So that might include working with other people. Unlike offline radicalization, though, where someone might need to like go overseas for wartime training, for example, the internet allows you to develop skills, maybe get materials and stuff online, so you don't need to go anywhere. So it allows for participation, and it allows for participation in public displays that don't require training or violence. So for example, hashtag campaigns to make an issue trend on social media, which might potentially recruit new members. So you're visually being part of the group, your language might be violent, but you might not actually have to physically go somewhere and commit violence to do it.
But there's also potentially like levels of anonymity in that as well. So there's still, while you might be engaging in like erratic behavior or encouraging recruitment through, say, X or another platform, you're not necessarily fully exposing yourself to any consequences either at that point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So in terms of pathways, exit pathways here, there's a couple in the research. Medical intervention brought about by an existing issue like mental health, addiction, or other unresolved issues like ADHD as well as one, though that has the potential to trigger a de-radicalization process. Now, like I said, not every radicalized person has mental health problems at all, but for some who do, this may be a route out. The other trigger that comes from the research was people who were forcibly institutionalized after a severe breakdown. So
they're
again,
completely cut off.
Yeah. So again, this is obviously not going to be applicable to all radicalized people, but it does show the level of effort and resources required to reach somebody at this stage. It is really significant. The final stage, and this is not one that everybody gets to, this is the stage of committing harm. In this paper by Booth and colleagues, overt violence was actually uncommon because they were looking specifically at online radicalization, and a lot of people in the data had parted ways with the community that they'd been attached to. But if you look at the news, there are so many examples of people who have actually gone on to commit violence as part of various groups like religious extremists, incels, the far right, and so on. There are plenty of violent acts and deaths that are connected to that. So the kind of violence taking place in online extreme spaces might be different to that of traditional violence and religious extremism. So, for example, Anders Breivik.
Yeah, so the guy in Norway. So he killed, 77 people? Yeah. So it was a shooting and it was a bombing. So it was in Oslo, and then it was also on Utoya, the island outside.
So traditional, like right-wing extremism or religious extremism, I think there's a more traditional path to violence in it. Like it tends to be like a more predictable outcome from that. Whereas there's other kinds of extremism. For example, if you're in a anti-vax space online, you might not vaccinate your children. Right? That's a different kind of violence because it opens up your child to quite a considerable threat to their health and their life, potentially, even more so during COVID. But the reason you're doing it isn't to commit a violent act. You're doing it out of protection and love and thinking this is the right thing for your child.
And it's very different. It's internalized and not impacting anyone else outside of your immediate family.
Except
the person
when
who you potentially carry a vaccine.
Except when herd immunity goes down and other people who can't get vaccinated suddenly get measles and COVID and whatnot.
Okay, I take back what I said.
Yeah. So it is a problem. Most radicalized people don't commit violent acts, right? We know that. But their support for the violence and the rhetoric encourages those who do commit it. And if you've ever heard the term stochastic terrorism, it basically means through rhetoric creating an environment where it is inevitable that somebody will carry out violent acts. I would say at the moment we have a lot of stochastic terrorism around trans people. There's so much violent rhetoric about who they are and the threat that people should be experiencing from them, that it is inevitable that attacks will be carried out.
Well, there have been.
Yes, and there have been.
I think with the trans community, I find the rhetoric is it's not overly extreme. It's simply just way too frequent for how large the trans community is. Even within like the trans community in sport in the United States, it's such a small
it's like 8 or 10 athletes at the college level.
Yeah, but it's such a small community and there's such a heightened focus on it.
Yeah.
And it's because it's salacious or it draws people's attention, and the fact that what bathroom someone uses, that you may or may not even be able to identify that person's gender, never mind not being any of your business, is actually not a threat to you or to anyone else.
But it was literally workshopped to find a topic because the trans community is so small. A lot of people don't know anyone who's trans. And if you don't know something, you don't know a person, you might be afraid of them because you know nothing about them and you think they're very different to you. And so it's really deliberate to create division and But it is encouraging violence against this group of people. At this stage of the pathway, the main exit is some sort of formal de-radicalization program run by governments or a non-profit organization, right? It is really, really difficult to talk somebody out of it at this point.
Okay. So significant life event, death of partner, spouse doesn't really have an impact.
It could do, like some of the previous pathways can still work sometimes, but when you've got someone who's actually committed violent acts for the cause, like they're very deeply embedded. There's a lot in their life that is about this now, and it's very hard to get somebody out.
So institutionalization is probably the closest or potentially most effective one.
Yeah. So, you want to try and avoid people getting here, right? So you need to catch people at the early stages if possible. So obviously radicalization has a significant effect on the individuals who are being radicalized, but of course very much on their relationships. So we talked about like the withdrawal from their current relationships, peers, family, etc. And like there's been so many news stories as well as communities where people discuss the fallout from radicalization about their families and so on. Particularly, like there's quite a lot of communities talking about the radicalization of friends and family from Fox News in America and conservative talk radio, and how like families are literally just being destroyed by this. So a lot of like adult children and teenagers even talking about going no contact with their parents, and like very specifically talking about their parents as people who brought them up as kind and empathetic people, but now have become like virulently racist and homophobic and with very, very extreme views. There's one example from one of the forums. So maybe you'd read this. This is an example from one of the forums.
My mother was literally my Sunday school teacher. To see her loudly and openly, joyously support objective racism, hate, bigotry, and blasphemy is too heartbreaking. Any attempt to dissuade her is met as disrespect or of the devil. My mother was kind and giving, filled with laughter and joy, and she always went out of her way to help others. That person slowly started dissolving in a solution of propaganda, ignorance, and evil. That's so interesting the way they're describing the language is past tense.
Yeah.
Like the mother is no longer around.
Yeah. Yeah, people really feel like the person they knew is gone and that they have no connection to them anymore. So often people are discussing their family or friends and they talk about how they voted specifically against their interests. So like if they were gay, for example, and their parents were specifically voting for candidates who wanted to ban gay marriage or gay people being teachers or things like that, or voting for candidates who were against trans people or abortion as healthcare. Like there's so many women who talked about how they were sexually assaulted and had abortions, or had a child, you know, who wasn't going to be born living for very long with fatal fetal abnormalities and had to go through the experience of having an abortion, and that their parents knew that and then voted for a candidate who was against all abortions. So they really talked about how they just couldn't understand how their parents or other people close to them could vote for someone who would commit these kind of acts. And
completely against their own ideology, or
Yeah.
but like even this, like I always find it very interesting when people who are super religious are really homophobic or full of hate, when it's like one of their like
Supposed to be
one of the biggest values is loving thy neighbor like you love yourself.
Yeah, I know.
And acceptance, and like just this kind of rhetoric is actually just a complete juxtaposition of how they're supposed to behave.
Fully. So like I know someone myself who was a very open person, very supportive of the LGBTQ plus community. And I think during COVID, maybe was off work for a while and obviously started to spend an awful lot of time online and got really into various different radical views, to the point where they started with some stuff around COVID, but they've gotten to the point where they believe that the earth is flat, which is so removed from reality that it's hard to know how to start to have a conversation with somebody like that to bring them back from where they're at. And they have cut off most of their family, most of their friends, because their views are very, anti-immigration, gay people are Satan, drag queens are trying to molest your children, never mind that the people in the church that they believe in are the ones who are generally molesting the children.
I can see how people can rationalize arguments for all of those things, with the exception of the earth being flat.
Yes, exactly. I feel like that is where you've no connection with reality anymore.
Yeah, that's what I mean. I can see whatever previous views, personal views, whatever. I'm not saying I agree with them, but saying that the earth is flat and I would just go, where does that come from? How are you rationalizing that? And then I would question the integrity of the person putting forward that argument. And then I would hope that anyone else who's listening to that argument would go straight away, no, this person is devoid of reality, and I can just ignore what they're saying.
Unless they're similarly radicalized, which is the people they are talking to online.
Other flat earthers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. I guess what comes away from this is that what happens offline is as important as online, right? The triggers are not really online triggers. They are caused by the offline environment. So we need to be looking at what's happening with people offline in order to prevent radicalization. And it's also really important to note that lots of us spend a lot of time online, and a lot of us come across content that might trigger extreme views in other people, but we've managed not to be radicalized, right? So it doesn't mean that if you come across something that is extreme online, you are going to be radicalized, or if your kid comes across something extreme online, they're going to be radicalized. There has to be some sort of vulnerability there. And there's actually quite a bit of evidence to show that being able to resist this information is actually associated with having a strong value system, a strong and clear sense of self-identity, and the intellectual capability to critically engage with the information that you read. So critical engagement, we come back to it so many times in this podcast, and we will again. Critical engagement is so massively important. It's why we teach it in psychology so much. It's why so many courses and programs of education teach it. It really, really helps with resisting misinformation, radicalization.
It reminds me of the persuasion episode. So where we talked about your ability to understand an argument for its emotional characteristics, for who's endorsing that message, and where logical argument is coming in, whether it is supported by shiny peripheral route influencer, or if it's facts, figures, and information that you can really rely on, whether that's the kind of radicalization through really extremist views.
Yeah.
If it's the vaccine arguments, if it's discussions around healthcare generally.
Yeah.
But being able to kind of break down those arguments and see what does or does not align to your beliefs. And then when it does or does not align to your beliefs, so whether you're pro or anti-abortion or LGBT rights, whatever it might be, that you're entitled to your opinion, right or wrong, or positive or negative, whatever way you want to put it. But it's at the point where it goes to another level where critical thinking is needed, that it becomes devoid of reality.
Yeah.
That's where people need to be kind of brought back. And the pathways, I think, is really interesting to break that down.
Yeah, absolutely. The other thing I will say is that, so education, I think, is important. Critical thinking education is important, but we have lots of examples of highly educated people who don't critically engage with information and believe misinformation and become radicalized. So it is not a foolproof inoculation against radicalization.
I would say it is for the majority of people. Yeah.
If you look at QAnon believers in the States, quite a lot of them are highly educated. So no. It depends on the radical group. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I hate to break that bubble.
I'm just
I know, we like to think what we're doing will really help, but sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. Thank you all for listening. You have been listening to In Bits, the podcast that deconstructs our digital lives. I have been Nicola.
I have been and still am Liam.
Yes, we have. You can find us on Blue Sky, Insta, TikTok, YouTube at In Bits Podcast. Like I said at the start, we'd love to hear from you. Please follow us to find out what our next topics will be. Get in touch with your experiences, your thoughts. We'd love to get feedback from you. So please leave us a review or a comment on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. This episode was produced and edited by Owen Hurley. And thank you also to Owen for our music, as always.
Thank you for listening. We'll see you in 2 weeks, wherever you get your podcasts. So Spotify or Apple Podcasts.
Or there's some other platforms too that I can't remember the name of.
Yeah.
See you all then.
See you in 2 weeks.